23 years ago, one of the deadliest bank robberies in American history. 3 men stormed into the U.S. bank branch in Norfolk, and in less than 40 seconds, 5 people were dead, 4 employees and a customer.
On September 26, 2002, just after 10 in the morning in Norfolk, Nebraska, police got a 911 call about an armed robbery.
In dispatch, PD Ops 1.
At the U.S. Bank branch on 13th Street and Passawalk Avenue. And within minutes, more calls came in about shots fired. A bank lobby had become a crime scene in less than 60 seconds, with 5 people dying on the floor, shot by 3 men who walked in high on methamphetamine with guns and a half-formed plan to get money. One of those shooters was Jorge Galindo, and 20 years later, he sits in a 6x8 cell on Nebraska's death row, filing appeals and insisting he wasn't the worst person in that room. But the bodies don't care about rankings, and neither do the families still waiting for something that resembles closure. The night before the massacre, Jorge Galindo, Jose Sandoval, and Erick Vela were tweaking out hard, awake for God knows how many hours, burning through whatever meth they could get their hands on, and somewhere in that chemical fog, they landed on the idea to rob a bank. It wasn't a sophisticated plan, because meth doesn't produce sophisticated plans. Rather, it produces paranoid, aggressive impulsivity, where the pause between thinking and doing gets erased completely. They were addicts whose lives had collapsed into one repeating loop. Get high, needing more, figure out how to get more, and repeat. Galindo's defense later argued that Sandoval was the ringleader, the dominant force who pushed the others into it. And maybe that was true in the sense that every group of addicts has someone calling shots. But the problem with claiming you were dominated by another tweaker is that despite all that, you still walked into that bank, still brought a gun. And when it came time to use it, you did. The cooperation Galindo showed after his arrest, talking to police and giving up information about Sandoval, might have suggested he was following rather than leading. But cooperation after 5 people are dead doesn't rewind the clock. The thing with meth heads and crime,
it's like your whole body tingles all over the place, and it's a good feeling. Happy, giddy, but then when you come down off of it, then people start wanting more, and they go crazy, and that's when they lose themselves.
So everything is turned into a right now urgency, where violence starts being the only thing that's logical and the obvious solution. But that's not really an excuse, because plenty of meth users don't commit murder. But it does explain how 3 men who probably weren't planning to kill anyone that morning ended up doing exactly that when the situation spiraled.
And the kind of moisture or smell you get in a small room when there's blood thrown out all over it. And I remember walking and seeing each of the bodies, each of the 5 as they, where they were in the bank.
What made the situation even more volatile was the fact that all 3 of them were in the same bad state, feeding off each other's paranoia and aggression without anyone there to pump the brakes. When you've got 3 people operating on meth logic simultaneously, reality becomes whatever they collectively decide it is in that moment. And if they decide that robbing a bank is doable and necessary, then there's no voice of reason cutting through the chemical haze to point out how catastrophically wrong that could go. On September 26th at almost 9 a.m., these 3 men walked into the bank in Norfolk while customers were making deposits and employees were processing transactions. And within minutes, the normal Thursday morning routine broke down into gunfire and bodies dropping. It all happened fast. One moment, it was a bank. The next, it was a massacre. And there was no drawn-out negotiation or standoff. Just immediate chaos where decisions were made in fractions of seconds, and 5 people ended up dead before anyone could process what was happening. However, no matter how spontaneous it seemed, the actual planning went back at least 2 weeks before the robbery, because they needed to watch the bank several times to figure out when money drops happened and how many employees worked at different times. According to Norfolk Police Captain Steve Hecker's testimony at the bond hearing, One suspect walked inside the bank to check out the layout, then walked back out and used a walkie-talkie to tell the others where employees were standing. The setup looked more like a military thing than what you'd expect from small-town criminals. And when they finally did it on September 26th, that planning showed in how fast and brutal everything went down. All three men came from Madison, a small Nebraska town where Galindo had dropped out of high school in 1998. Sandoval had left during his freshman year in 1995, and a fourth guy, Gabriel Rodriguez, had quit after 8th grade in 1991. Their records were mostly drug and weapons charges, the kind of the stuff that goes through rural courts without much attention until it suddenly turns into something way worse. Sandoval had done prison time from 1995 to 2000 for burglary, and Rodriguez had served from 1995 to 1998, even trying to escape from work release twice. Vela had been arrested just the week before for carrying a hidden weapon, but Nebraska State Trooper Mark Zach screwed up 2 numbers on the gun's serial number when he processed it, which meant the computer check didn't show the weapon was stolen, and Vela got to walk. That mistake ate at Trooper Zach so bad that the day after the bank shooting, he killed himself. He couldn't handle knowing that his paperwork error had let a killer go free just days before 5 people died. His death added another body to a case that was already drowning in them. On the morning of the 26th, they wore stocking caps or maybe ski masks and dark baggy clothes when they walked into the U.S. Bank branch. With Spot on recon, they knew where the employees would be, where the counters were, how to get through the space fast before anyone could hit an alarm. According to Hecker's testimony, they started shooting the second they came through the door, and the first victim was customer Yvonne Tuttle, 37, standing at a teller's counter doing regular bank stuff when a bullet hit her in the head. One of the gunmen jumped right over the counter, and in 40 seconds, 4 bank employees were dead. The bank's security cameras caught Tuttle getting killed, but not what happened after the gunman went behind the counter, which meant the worst parts happened off camera in the back areas where employees worked. Another customer who started walking in during the shooting got hit in the shoulder as she ran to her car, almost becoming victim number 6. What's crazy is they got nothing. $0. They planned for weeks, used walkie-talkies, shot 5 people in the head, and walked out empty-handed. The whole point was supposed to be money, but all they got was bodies.
The killers are still on the loose, and police do not know which way they're headed. The suspects are 3 Hispanic or white men wearing gray clothes. They're driving a 2003 white Subaru Outback with in-transit plates that they apparently stole from a Norfolk neighborhood. They are still armed and dangerous, so obviously police all over the region are on the lookout for these very dangerous men.
No money, just bodies. It went to hell in the bank. That's what Vela told investigators after they arrested him. 5 words that said everything about how badly the robbery failed. Lola Elwood was working her shift that morning, doing the same job she'd done hundreds of times for 14 years, when Galindo walked up to her and asked if she had triggered the alarm. According to Galindo's own account, she might have said yes, or nodded, or maybe said nothing at all. But we'll never know, because immediately after asking, he shot her in the face. Not the chest, not the shoulder, but the face, which is as personal and brutal as execution gets. However, 2 employees survived the massacre. Cheryl Cahoy, a U.S. bank operations specialist, and Susan Stair, an internal auditor from Lincoln who happened to be visiting the branch that day. They were in Lola Elwood's office when the 3 men stormed in, and what they saw in those 40 seconds would become the core of the prosecution's case. Cahoy testified at trial about what she witnessed from inside that office, watching through the peripheral vision as armed men moved through the bank, the sound of gunshots echoing in the enclosed space. The surveillance footage showed the men were already shooting as they ran into the bank, hitting each victim in the head within those 40 seconds. Then one of the gunmen jumped over the counter and the killing continued behind it, away from where the cameras could see. About 3 more people, all bank employees, were executed in quick succession. Lisa Bryant, 29, Joe Mausbach, 42, and Samuel Sun, 50. What the surveillance cameras did catch was what happened next. A customer named Kepke was in the bank when the shooting started, and he tried to run. The footage showed Galindo taking aim at him in what firearms experts would later identify as a modified Weaver stance, which is something like a two-handed shooting position that's taught in firearms training, and definitely not something you stumble into accidentally. The evidence at trial demonstrated that Galindo shot at Kopka at least twice as he tried to escape, but both shots missed, and Kopka made it out alive. After he escaped, the surveillance tape showed Sandoval jumping back over the counter and the three men fleeing. The tape also showed Galindo briefly hesitating before following the others out. That hesitation would become a point of argument during sentencing because some argued that it was remorse for what he'd just done, while others said it was just confusion about which way to run. Either way, by the time he left the building, 5 people were dead on the floor and $0 had been taken. The entire operation, from entry to exit, lasted just over a minute. The 3 men ran from the bank and went 2 blocks to a house where they forced their way inside, pointed guns at 2 residents, and stole the keys to a Subaru Outback. Then they drove. But police caught them 3 hours later at 11:30 a.m. during a traffic stop at a gas station in O'Neill, 76 miles away. They were in a stolen Ford pickup by then, which meant they'd ditched their previous vehicle somewhere. Rodriguez got arrested separately around midnight. He'd been sitting outside the bank in his car during the robbery, and when the shooting started, he drove off and left the others. No money was ever recovered. The 3 handguns they used turned up along a road between Ewing and Clearwater, tossed out by them when they were trying to get rid of evidence. But it didn't matter since the surveillance footage had them. The witnesses also had them. So, the evidence was overwhelming.
At the time that this happened, this was one of the deadliest bank robberies in at least a decade. And because of the severity of the crime, the Madison County Courthouse, which is a very small courthouse, they had to construct barriers and change most of its procedures because of the crowds that were there. And it's kind of funny to say, but they had to protect the criminals.
The bond hearing the next day brought about 50 people into a Madison County courtroom that was built for 30. Friends of the suspects and relatives of the dead. Yvonne Tuttle's college-age daughter was there right in the courtroom, and then she went out to cry in the hallway before it started because she couldn't hold it in any longer. She couldn't understand how her mom went to the bank and got executed. Madison County Judge Richard Crapella heard the captain, Hecker, lay out what the security cameras showed, the walkie-talkies, the planning, the executions, and ordered all 4 men held without bond. Each faced 5 counts of first-degree murder, and prosecutors made it clear they wanted the death penalty. The trials happened in 2003, and each defendant got his own verdict. Vela pleaded guilty in January 2003 and was sentenced to death on January 12, 2007. He admitted to everything and didn't leave out any details. This somehow spared the victims' families from having to sit through testimony about how their loved ones died. Sandoval's trial came in May 2003, moved to Hamilton County in Aurora because finding anyone in Norfolk who hadn't already formed an opinion was basically impossible. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before finding him guilty on all 5 counts. He got the death penalty too. Then Galindo's trial followed, and it just showed how much the community already knew. Jury selection alone meant that the case had deeply saturated northeastern Nebraska. Out of 156 potential jurors, almost 60% said they could be fair, but nearly 30% admitted they'd already made up their minds. Finding impartial jurors in a town that had followed every headline was nearly impossible, but the trial moved forward with those who promised to judge only the evidence. The prosecution built its case carefully presenting surveillance footage, witnesses who described the planning, the walkie-talkies used during the robbery, and the trips to the bank before the attack. Forensic experts explained bullet trajectories, gunshot residue, and physical evidence that tied all 3 men to the scene. It was a case constructed piece by piece, very logical, detailed, and devastatingly clear. So the defense tried a different approach. How? They didn't deny Galindo was involved, but they now argued that he wasn't the mastermind and claimed he was under the influence of meth and easily led by the actual ringleader, Sandoval. Sandoval was actually convicted for 2 additional murders in 2008. So to back their argument, they brought in Claudia Solis, who testified about using meth with Galindo at a local residence before the crime. That meant the narrative was that he was a follower, a young man, only 21, whose drug use clouded his judgment and left him vulnerable to manipulation. But the jury still wasn't convinced. They found him guilty on all 5 counts of first-degree murder. And in Nebraska, that verdict just begins the sentencing phase. That's where the real fight for a defendant's life happens. In March 2004, a 3-judge panel met to decide whether Galindo should die for what he'd done. The prosecution and defense did their thing, with the defense even saying that life in prison without parole was punishment enough. The judges disagreed and ruled that the severity of the crime outweighed every mitigating factor. 5 people had been shot in the head in 40 seconds for nothing, and Galindo was sentenced to death. 1 sentence for each victim. The appeals began almost immediately and continue today, dragging through decades of legal battles and failed petitions. More than 20 years later, the case still lingers and is another name on Nebraska's long, unfinished list of death row inmates. In September 2022, Galindo made a bid for the Nebraska Supreme Court to rehear his case, and the court issued a split decision, but the majority ruled against him. That decision came more than 20 years after the murders, which gives you a sense of how slowly the appellate process moves in capital cases. When that failed, Galindo's lawyers turned to the federal courts, which is almost the final stop when every other door had closed. In December 2023, they filed a writ of habeas corpus claiming his trial was unfair and that his constitutional rights had been violated. In simpler terms, it was a desperate move, asking federal judges to step in where the state had refused. These petitions are common in death penalty cases, but they're rarely successful, and Galindo knew the odds were slim. Still, it was his last chance. But as of 2025, that petition is still sitting in the system with no hearings, rulings, or progress. The wait has somewhat become part of the punishment itself, the slow rhythm of death row where years pass in legal silence. But just a few months before that filing, in September 2023, the Nebraska Supreme Court had already shut down another of Galindo's attempts to fight his case. He'd requested post-conviction relief, a process that lets inmates challenge their convictions after all normal appeals have failed, often claiming their lawyers did a poor job or that new evidence was ignored. But the court wasn't convinced. In a 73-page decision, the justices ruled that his claims didn't show any major constitutional violation serious enough to reopen the case. It was another door closed and another chance gone. And while Galindo's legal battle dragged on, Nebraska itself was wrestling with the death penalty. In 2015, lawmakers voted to abolish it entirely, which should have converted all death sentences into life imprisonment. But the following year, voters overturned that decision in a statewide referendum, reinstating capital punishment. What should have brought finality instead created confusion, especially for Galindo. Since then, the state has been stuck in limbo, arguing over which drugs to use for lethal injection, struggling to find suppliers, and facing lawsuits over whether the process violates the constitutional ban on cruel and unusual punishment. As of 2024, 11 people, including Galindo, remain on Nebraska's death row, but none have a scheduled execution date. Galindo sits in a cell that measures 6 feet by 8 feet, spending 23 hours a day there with 1 hour of recreation time in a slightly larger cage. He's been there for more than 22 years now, and he'll likely be there for years more while his federal habeas petition works through the court system. If that petition gets denied, his attorneys will probably file additional appeals, exhausting every possible legal avenue before Nebraska could schedule an execution. And even if all his appeals eventually fail, there's no guarantee Nebraska will have resolved its execution protocol issues by then. The bank branch where it all happened still operates in Norfolk, remodeled so there's no visible trace of that day in September. New employees work there now, serving customers who might not even know the building's history. 23 years is long enough that children born after the massacre are adults now. And for people who've moved to Norfolk since then, the case is just local history, rather than lived trauma. What remains unchanged is that Lola Elwood, Lisa Bryant, Joe Mausbach, Samuel Sun, and Yvonne Tuttle were alive that morning and dead by 9 a.m., shot in the head in 40 seconds by men who planned for weeks and accomplished nothing except destruction. If you want to see more chilling videos like this, like and subscribe, and stay tuned for more.
When I am weak